You've probably seen it before, the MP40, that iconic German submachine gun, with its folding stock and long, curved magazine. But for American soldiers during World War II, this wasn't just another weapon. It was a threat, a symbol of enemy efficiency and cunning. Of the MP40's distinctive sound, its chattering fire, in the midst of chaos haunted the Allies on the battlefield. But why did it evoke such hatred? Was it simply the fear of the enemy's firepower? Or was there more to this weapon's dark legacy? To understand the MP40's notorious reputation among American soldiers, we need to rewind the clock to a time when warfare was changing forever. Picture the muddy, blood-soaked trenches of World War I, where the long-range rifles that once defined combat were suddenly rendered useless in narrow, brutal fighting spaces. That's where the submachine gun was born, small, fast-firing, and lethal up close. And by the time the MP40 arrived, it would change the way wars were fought, both on the front lines and in the minds of those who faced it. At the start of the 20th century, warfare was defined by long-range engagements, with armies relying on bolt-action rifles for power and precision. In the case of the Germans, their infantrymen were armed with long, powerful rifles that could reach out hundreds of meters, enabling snipers and marksmen to pick off targets from a distance. The same was true for the Allies, who also depended on rifles that emphasized accuracy, range, and lethality. But everything changed with the advent of World War I. The war turned into a grinding stalemate of trench warfare. The conditions were horrendous. Instead of open battlefields, soldiers found themselves trapped in narrow, muddy trenches, sometimes no more than a few feet apart. The open mobile warfare that had been envisioned, with cavalry charges and advancing infantry, was impossible. The new weaponry, water-cooled machine guns, quick-firing artillery made it deadly to move or charge in the open. For the first time, aerial reconnaissance allowed armies to track enemy movements in real time, further trapping soldiers in their positions. This shift to static warfare, with massive casualties and little ground gained, created a crisis. Soldiers spent months, even years, in these trenches, shelling and counter-sheltering, locked in a cycle of violence that offered no solution. The old way of thinking about warfare, long-range engagements with rifles, no longer made sense. What was needed were weapons that could handle the brutal, up-close, and personal nature of trench fighting. Rifles were too long and slow to use in the confined space of trenches, while machine guns like the Maxim, though powerful, were too heavy and cumbersome to carry through the mud. The solution would come from an unexpected source: submachine guns. The concept of the submachine gun, which fired pistol cartridges but could deliver a higher rate of fire than a standard rifle, emerged from the need for a more effective weapon in close-quarters combat. Early experiments were clumsy, but by 1918, the Germans had designed the world's first practical submachine gun, the MP18. This new weapon, chambered in 9mm, could fire a large number of rounds quickly, with much greater control than the larger, heavier machine guns. The MP18 was not just a weapon, it was a game-changer. It was first used in the German Spring Offensive of 1918, a desperate attempt to break the stalemate of trench warfare. Stormtrooper units, armed with the MP18, would sneak into enemy trenches under the cover of darkness, laying down a storm of automatic fire. This new style of combat, walking fire, where soldiers advanced while shooting, disrupted the slow, deliberate tactics used by other soldiers. The MP18 allowed them to clear trenches quickly, causing chaos among enemy ranks. Although the offensive ultimately failed, the MP18 made a lasting impression. With its 32-round drum magazine and rapid rate of fire, 350 to 500 rounds per minute, it proved incredibly effective in trench warfare. Though fewer than 30,000 MP18s were produced, it opened the eyes of military leaders around the world. The idea of the submachine gun, the MP18's speed and effectiveness in close quarters, would inspire countless new designs across nations. But despite the war ending, the need for a weapon like the MP18 did not disappear. The Treaty of Versailles limited German arms production, but the Germans were already planning their next move, knowing another war was on the horizon. With the lessons of World War I still fresh, they began to develop new submachine guns, continuing to refine and perfect the design. As the world moved into the 1930s, the threat of war was growing once again. Germany, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, began rebuilding its military. Despite the limitations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, the Germans knew that they would soon need weapons that could keep up with modern tactics, especially for fast-moving, mobile warfare. The lessons learned from the Great War showed that trench warfare was outdated. A new war, one filled with rapid movements, tanks, and aircraft, was on the horizon. The Germans began to see that submachine guns, like the MP40, would play a key role in this new type of warfare. By the time 1938 rolled around, the German military had a new vision for its submachine gun. It wanted something lighter, more practical, and easier to mass produce. So, a German engineer named Heinrich Vollmer was tasked with designing a new model. Vollmer's creation, the MP38, was a marked improvement over its predecessor, the MP18. Unlike the MP18, which had a bulky, wood-stock design, the MP38 featured a sleek, metal frame with a folding stock. This made it more compact and easier to handle in tight spaces. This was especially useful for soldiers in armored vehicles or paratroopers who needed a more portable weapon. The MP38, chambered in 9mm, used a 32-round box magazine and fired at a rate of around 500 rounds per minute. It had a relatively simple design with a blowback operating system, making it easier and cheaper to produce. This design helped streamline production and allowed the weapon to be built quickly and efficiently. However, despite these improvements, the MP38 still had a few weaknesses. The metal used in the construction of the MP38 would heat up after prolonged use, making it uncomfortable to hold. This was because the plastic parts, like the foregrip and pistol grip, did not handle heat as well as the wooden stocks used on older weapons. Soldiers quickly learned to wear gloves to avoid burning their hands during heavy use. The MP38 was introduced into service in 1939, just in time for the German invasion of Poland. At first, only a small number of these new submachine guns were available, but as the war progressed, their numbers began to grow. Although it was a powerful weapon, it was clear that the MP38's production could not keep up with the needs of the expanding German army. This led to the development of a new version, the MP40. The MP40 was designed to be simpler and cheaper to produce than the MP38. It was built using stamped sheet metal parts, rather than the more expensive milled parts used in the earlier design. This change allowed for faster production and reduced costs. In fact, the MP40 became one of the most produced weapons of World War II, with over 1 million units produced by the end of the war. However, mass production did not come without its problems. Early versions of the MP40 were prone to jamming, as the rush production did not allow for proper quality control. But over time, these issues were resolved, and the MP40 became a reliable and effective weapon for the German forces. One of the most significant improvements in the MP40 over the MP38 was the addition of a safety feature. The MP38 had a major flaw: it lacked a proper safety mechanism. As a result, the weapon was prone to accidental discharge if it was dropped or jolted. This was a dangerous flaw, especially in the chaotic environment of battle. The MP40 fixed this problem with a new safety system. The bolt handle could be locked into place with a dual-slot safety notch, ensuring that the weapon would not fire accidentally. This small change made the MP40 safer for soldiers to use, especially when handling it in rough conditions. Although the MP40 was now safer and cheaper to produce, it was still a specialist weapon. It was not intended to replace the standard infantry rifles, like the Carabiner 98K. Instead, it was designed to be used by officers, assault groups, and tank crews. The German infantry squads were structured around the heavier machine guns, like the MG34 and MG42, which provided the main firepower. Soldiers with the MP40 were often leaders or specialists, such as paratroopers or tank crews, who needed a lightweight, fast-firing weapon for close-quarters combat. Despite its role as a specialist weapon, the MP40 became widely used during the Blitzkrieg campaigns in the early years of World War II. As the Germans advanced through Poland, France, and the Low Countries, the MP40 proved to be highly effective in the fast-moving battles of the early war. The weapon was particularly useful in urban combat, where close-range engagements were common. As the Germans pushed deeper into enemy territory, the MP40 became a symbol of their military might. But despite its success, in the early years of the war, the MP40 faced challenges. As the conflict went on, the German army was running into problems with production, and they were unable to keep up with the demand for MP40s. Meanwhile, the Allies were adapting their own weapons to counter the German threat. The American M3 grease gun, for example, borrowed some elements from the MP40, but it was cheaper and easier to produce. The British Sten gun was even simpler, costing only a fraction of what it took to produce the MP40. As the war dragged on, the Germans found themselves fighting not only the Allies, but also the Soviet Red Army. In the brutal battles on the Eastern Front, the Germans found that they were facing submachine guns from the Soviets, like the PPSh-41, which were even more effective than the MP40 in some situations. The PPSh-41 had a higher rate of fire, and its simpler design made it more reliable in harsh conditions. As the Germans encountered more Soviet submachine guns, they began to adapt, even using captured PPSh-41 seconds in combat. Some were even modified to fire 9mm ammunition, the same as the MP40. The MP40's role in the war became more complicated as it was faced with increasing competition from weapons like the PPSh-41. Despite this, the MP40 remained a key weapon for the Germans, particularly in urban combat and close-quarters fighting. It was a symbol of German ingenuity and military power, but also a reminder of the limitations of submachine guns in modern warfare. When the German forces first advanced across Europe, they brought with them the MP40, a weapon that struck fear into the hearts of the Allied soldiers. The weapon's distinctive appearance and terrifying firepower quickly made it a symbol of German military strength. The MP40 was designed for close-range combat, a role it was perfectly suited for in the fast-moving Blitzkrieg tactics. It could spray bullets with incredible speed, and this made it particularly effective when German soldiers were fighting at close quarters in the cities, villages, and forests of Europe. The first time Allied troops encountered the MP40 in battle was during the German invasion of France in 1940. As the Germans stormed through the country, their soldiers armed with the MP40 broke through defenses with terrifying speed. The Allies had been caught off guard by the speed of the attack. The Germans were no longer using the slow, methodical methods of the past. Instead, they moved quickly, striking where the Allies least expected it. The MP40 was often used in urban combat, where the streets and buildings provided the perfect cover for close-range battles. The weapon's high rate of fire allowed the Germans to clear buildings and streets quickly, overwhelming the Allies in close-quarter combat. The Allies soon realized that their own weapons were no match for the MP40 in these conditions. Their rifles, designed for long-range engagements, were too slow to be effective in the chaos of urban warfare. The German submachine gun, on the other hand, was fast, compact, and deadly at short distances. For the American soldiers, the MP40 was a particularly frustrating enemy weapon. They were used to the heavier, more powerful weapons like the M1 Garand and the Thompson submachine gun. These American weapons were reliable and accurate, but they weren't designed for the kind of fast-paced urban combat the Germans were now mastering. The MP40, with its rapid fire and lighter weight, could easily outmaneuver and overpower American infantry in close-quarters battle. American soldiers began to develop a deep hatred for the MP40, not just because of its firepower, but because of the confusion it caused on the battlefield. The sound of the MP40 firing became an unmistakable signal that danger was near. Its distinctive chatter filled the air during battles, and it was often impossible for soldiers to tell where the fire was coming from. This confusion, combined with the weapon's deadly accuracy, made it one of the most feared guns of the war. But it wasn't just the noise and the fear of being shot that made the MP40 hated, it was also the weapon's unpredictability. Early versions of the MP40 had significant mechanical issues, which caused them to jam at inopportune moments. The Allies soon realized that the weapon's reputation was not entirely deserved. The MP40, despite its firepower, was far from perfect. The early models of the weapon were prone to malfunction, and soldiers reported frequent misfires. The magazines, designed to hold 32 rounds, were often problematic. They would easily jam if not handled properly, and soldiers had to be especially careful when loading or unloading them. American soldiers found themselves caught between the terror of the MP40 and the reality of its flaws. They learned to be cautious when approaching German soldiers armed with the MP40. But they also knew that it wasn't invincible. In some cases, the weapon's reliability issues made it just as dangerous for the Germans as it was for the Allies. Still, the MP40 was a constant threat on the battlefield, and its presence could change the outcome of a battle in seconds. As the war progressed, the Allies began capturing German weapons, including the MP40, during their advances across Europe. However, using a captured weapon was not always as straightforward as it seemed. For one thing, the MP40 had a very distinctive sound when it fired, and this created confusion on the battlefield. Allied soldiers who used the MP40 often found themselves mistaken for Germans, which led to friendly fire incidents. This issue became especially dangerous during major battles like Day, when confusion reigned and every soldier was on edge. It was reported that during the U.S. Ranger assault at Point du Hoc on Day, some Rangers picked up MP40s from fallen German soldiers, only to be mistakenly targeted by their own troops. The incident led to casualties on both sides, as the sound of the MP40 confused American soldiers, who were not expecting their own men to be armed with German weapons. The Allies quickly learned that the MP40 was not only dangerous because of its firepower, but also because it created chaos on the battlefield. Its distinctive sound made it easy for German soldiers to identify their own, but it was a nightmare for the Allies, who struggled to tell friend from foe in the heat of battle. In the end, the MP40's presence on the battlefield led to more confusion than any other weapon, and this was one of the reasons American soldiers despised it so much. But despite its flaws and the confusion it caused, the MP40 remained one of the most feared and respected weapons in the German arsenal. It was not the most powerful submachine gun of the war, but it was the one that struck the most fear into the hearts of Allied soldiers. Its high rate of fire, its compact design, and its ability to overwhelm opponents in close quarters made it an essential part of the German war effort. The battle for Stalingrad in 1942 marked one of the most brutal and intense phases of World War II. The city, which sat on the Volga River, became a symbol of Soviet resistance, but it also revealed the true nature of close-quarters combat. For the German army, the urban battlefields of Stalingrad turned into a deadly labyrinth of ruined buildings, alleyways, and bomb craters. The once pristine streets of the city were reduced to rubble, and both sides found themselves fighting for every inch of ground. This type of warfare was unlike anything the Germans had experienced in their earlier Blitzkrieg campaigns. The fast, open battles of the early years of the war had given way to brutal house-to-house fighting. The cramped, broken streets of Stalingrad made it difficult for soldiers to use long-range weapons effectively. The narrow hallways and rooms in the city's buildings forced soldiers into close-quarters combat, where a submachine gun like the MP40 would prove to be an essential tool for survival. The MP40, with its rapid rate of fire and compact design, was well suited for urban warfare. Soldiers could move quickly through the ruins, clearing rooms and streets with ease. The MP40 allowed the Germans to control the fighting within the confines of the city. It became a weapon of choice for stormtroopers and infantrymen who were tasked with taking and holding critical positions. The sound of the MP40's rapid fire echoed through the wreckage, a constant reminder of the violence that was unfolding. However, the MP40 faced its first real challenge during the Battle of Stalingrad, not from the Soviet forces, but from a rival weapon. The Soviet Union, having suffered from the initial German onslaught, began to adapt and produce their own submachine gun, the PPSh-41. The PPSh-41 was a much cheaper and simpler design compared to the German MP40, but it had one critical advantage: a higher rate of fire. The PPSh-41 could fire up to 1,200 rounds per minute, nearly doubling the MP40's rate of fire. In the close-quarters urban fighting of Stalingrad, the sheer volume of bullets fired by the PPSh-41 proved to be a game-changer. Soviet soldiers, armed with the PPSh-41, could quickly empty entire magazines in a matter of seconds. The rapid fire, combined with the weapon's larger 71-round drum magazine, allowed Soviet troops to suppress German positions with relentless intensity. This made the MP40 despite its more controlled fire, seemed less effective in certain situations. While the MP40 remained a reliable weapon, it was at a disadvantage in the streets of Stalingrad, where overwhelming firepower often trumped accuracy. The Germans were finding it difficult to deal with the speed and volume of Soviet fire, especially in the confined spaces of the city. The Soviet soldiers, armed with their faster-firing PPSh-41 seconds, could flood German positions with bullets, forcing them to retreat or seek cover. The Germans responded to this challenge by adapting. They began capturing and using Soviet weapons, including the PSH-41, during the battle. The German soldiers even started modifying the captured PSH-41 seconds to use 9mm ammunition, which was the same caliber as the MP40. Some 10,000 of these converted weapons were made, and they became an essential part of the German arsenal. The irony was not lost on the soldiers. They were now using the very weapons they had once feared. But while the MP40 was outclassed in some aspects by the PPSH-41, it still had its advantages. The MP40 was more controllable, and its accuracy at longer ranges made it a more versatile weapon. In the open areas of Stalingrad, where the fighting sometimes shifted to open spaces or long corridors, the MP40's accuracy and rate of fire made it effective. It also had a reputation for reliability, which the PPSH-41, with its heavier recoil and more complex drum magazine, sometimes lacked. As the battle raged on, the city of Stalingrad became a place where both the MP40 and PPSH-41 were tested to their limits. Both weapons, in their own way, symbolized the shift in modern warfare. Fighting no longer relied on long-range engagements, but on the ability to dominate at close range, to move swiftly and decisively in urban environments. The battle would ultimately end in a crushing Soviet victory. But for the Germans, the lessons of Stalingrad were clear. The MP40, though effective, was no longer enough on its own. It was a tool, but not the solution to all the challenges of urban warfare. The close-quarters fighting in Stalingrad also revealed another weakness of the MP40, the limited capacity of its 32-round magazine. Soldiers soon realized that reloading during intense firefights was a vulnerable moment. The PPSH-41, with its larger drum magazine, allowed Soviet soldiers to keep firing longer without needing to reload, which proved crucial in the frantic, brutal exchanges of fire in the city. Despite the MP40's challenges in Stalingrad, its role in the conflict cemented its place as one of the most iconic weapons of the war. It was a weapon of speed, efficiency, and terror, perfectly suited for the fast-paced, chaotic nature of Blitzkrieg combat. But as the war continued, it became clear that new weapons and new tactics would be needed to counter the evolving challenges of modern warfare. As the war continued to unfold across Europe, the Allies found themselves engaged not only in a battle against the German forces but also in a fight against confusion and miscommunication. The German MP40, despite its limitations, was still a formidable weapon, and it continued to strike fear into the hearts of American soldiers. The weapon's distinct sound, its rapid fire, rhythmic chatter was one that became instantly recognizable. And for good reason. When the MP40 was used in battle, it often meant a deadly close-quarters encounter. But as the Allies began to push through German-occupied territories, they soon found themselves faced with the dilemma of capturing and dealing with German weapons, especially the MP40. The Americans, who had their own reliable weapons, including the Thompson submachine gun and the M1 Garand rifle, were not initially prepared to handle German weapons. But as they advanced through Europe, they inevitably encountered German weapons left behind on the battlefield. This included the MP40, which had become ubiquitous in the hands of German infantry and officers. In theory, capturing an enemy weapon should have been an advantage. But the reality of using the MP40 was more complicated than the Allies had anticipated. For one thing, the MP40 had a distinctive sound when it fired, and this became a major problem for the Allies. The sound of the MP40 was immediately recognizable, and when American soldiers picked up captured MP40s, they were often mistaken for Germans. This led to several friendly fire incidents, where American soldiers unknowingly targeted their own comrades because they mistook the sound of the MP40 for that of an enemy gun. One notable example of this occurred during the U.S. Ranger assault on Point du Hoc during day. Some Rangers, After encountering and defeating German troops, found MP40s lying on the battlefield, they decided to use the captured weapons, hoping to gain an advantage in the battle. However, the distinctive sound of the MP40 quickly caused confusion. The Rangers were mistaken for German soldiers, and 4 of them were tragically killed by friendly fire. This incident highlighted the dangers of using captured weapons in the chaos of battle, where distinguishing between friend and foe could be incredibly difficult. Beyond the confusion caused by the sound of the MP40, American soldiers also found the weapon's mechanical flaws to be a challenge. The MP40, though reliable in many situations, was not without its faults. Early versions of the weapon had issues with jamming, particularly when the magazine was not properly loaded, or when the weapon was exposed to harsh conditions like mud or dust. The magazine design itself, while innovative, was prone to misfeeds, especially when soldiers handled it roughly. In battle, the pressure to reload quickly and get back into the fight often led to mistakes, and soldiers quickly learned to be cautious with the MP40. Some even found it easier to avoid loading the full 32 rounds in the magazine, as doing so would compress the spring too much, increasing the chance of a jam. Despite these issues, American soldiers still had to deal with the reality that the MP40 was in the hands of the enemy. In some cases, they were forced to use captured weapons when they had no other option. This was especially true when they were outnumbered or when they found themselves in situations where their own ammunition or weapons were unavailable or ineffective. The Allies' reliance on their own submachine guns, like the M1 Thompson, meant that they weren't as familiar with the MP40, and the weapons controls were different enough to make it difficult to use in a pinch. Another complication came from the way the MP40 was handled by American troops. Unlike the more familiar American submachine guns, the MP40 was designed to be used with a different grip. The magazine was placed in such a way that soldiers had to hold the weapon by a small grip near the front, while many Americans instinctively held it by the magazine. This often led to problems, as holding the MP40 by the magazine could cause it to bend, misfeed, or jam during use. The magazine was designed with a double-column feed, but the single-feed design at the bottom made it prone to issues when not properly handled. To further complicate matters, the MP40 was heavier than some of the American submachine guns, such as the Thompson, and it required more effort to control during rapid firing. This, combined with its shorter stock and lack of an effective recoil buffer, made it a less comfortable weapon for American soldiers to use in combat. They quickly realized that while the MP40 was deadly in the hands of the enemy, it was not as easy to use effectively when captured. Despite these difficulties, the MP40 had its place in the Allies' understanding of German tactics. Its design would influence the development of future weapons. In particular, the American M3 grease gun was a direct response to the MP40. The M3 borrowed elements from the MP40, such as its compact design and rapid rate of fire, but it was designed to be simpler and cheaper to produce. The M3, often described as a crude weapon, was made of stamped metal parts and was intended to be mass-produced at a low cost. This approach was in stark contrast to the MP40, which, while more carefully engineered, still faced significant production challenges. The British also developed their own version of a cheap, mass-produced submachine gun, the Sten, which was even more rudimentary than the M3. Both the M3 and the Sten were inspired by the German MP40, but they were designed to be easier to produce and more reliable in the field. While the MP40 remained a symbol of German military innovation, the Allies' own weapons, including the M3 and the Sten, proved to be more practical for the unique challenges of modern warfare. Ultimately, the MP40's legacy was one of both admiration and frustration. On one hand, it was a highly effective weapon in close-quarters combat, and it became a symbol of the German army's ability to innovate and adapt to new forms of warfare. On the other hand, its flaws, its heavy recoil, unreliable magazines, and tendency to jam made it less effective than it could have been. For American soldiers, the MP40 was a weapon to be feared, but also one that they were able to eventually overcome. By the end of World War II, the MP40 had earned its place in history. However, this place was not defined by unchallenged superiority. Instead, it was shaped by its role in a rapidly evolving landscape of weaponry, tactics, and innovation. Despite its iconic status, the MP40 ultimately represented a crossroads in the development of modern firearms. It was a weapon that was both highly effective and deeply flawed, and its legacy would be one of lessons learned and paths taken that would shape future conflicts. As the war continued, the MP40's limitations became more apparent. While it was an exceptional tool for the close quarters, urban combat of the early years of the war, the weapon's shortcomings became clearer in the later stages of the conflict. The MP40's relatively short effective range, combined with the slow reloading process and its troublesome magazine, made it less suited for the types of battles the Germans were fighting in the latter years of the war. The most significant competition for the MP40, however, came not from other submachine guns, but from an entirely new class of weapon, the assault rifle. The German military, having learned from the mistakes and limitations of the MP40, sought to develop a new weapon that could bridge the gap between the power of rifles and the rapid-fire capacity of submachine guns. This led to the creation of the Sturmgewehr 44, or StG-44. In 1944, the StG-44, often regarded as the world's first true assault rifle, used an intermediate cartridge that was more powerful than a pistol round, but still manageable for automatic fire. This weapon had a much higher effective range than the MP40 and could still deliver devastating firepower at close quarters. With its 30-round magazine, the StG-44 was able to combine the firepower of a machine gun with the versatility and portability of a rifle. It was revolutionary in its design and served as the blueprint for later assault rifles, including the Soviet AK-47, which would dominate warfare in the decades to come. While the StG-44 was a game-changer, it came too late to save Germany in the war. Production was limited, and by the time it was ready for widespread use, the tide of battle had already turned against the Nazis. Nevertheless, the StG-44 marked the end of the MP40's era, and it demonstrated the need for more versatile, longer-range weapons on the battlefield. In the wake of World War II, the legacy of the MP40 persisted, not only as a symbol of German military ingenuity but also as a reminder of the changing nature of warfare. As the world entered the Cold War, the development of modern assault rifles would dominate military thinking, and the MP40's flaws, its limited range, its reliance on pistol ammunition, and its mechanical issues would become increasingly apparent. The rise of assault rifles, like the AK-47 and the M16, would lead to the eventual phasing out of weapons like the MP40. However, the MP40's influence on submachine gun design remained significant. It was widely copied by other nations, and its basic design principles were incorporated into new submachine guns in the decades that followed. In particular, the concept of a compact, rapid-firing weapon for close-quarters combat continued to be a key feature in the development of modern military firearms. Even though the MP40 was gradually replaced by newer, more advanced designs, its presence on the battlefield during World War II was undeniable. The MP40 also left its mark in terms of its cultural impact. As one of the most recognized weapons of World War II, the MP40 has been immortalized in countless films, documentaries, and video games. Its distinctive look, with the folding stock and curved magazine, became synonymous with the German military during the war. It was the weapon of choice for soldiers in the German army, particularly in special units like paratroopers and assault groups, and it became an iconic symbol of the Blitzkrieg era. For American soldiers, the MP40 was a weapon to be feared, but it was also one that represented a turning point in the nature of combat. The Americans, who had initially struggled to deal with the MP40 in urban and close-quarters combat, would later develop their own weapons to counter it. The Thompson submachine gun, the M3 grease gun, and the M1 Garand all reflected American adaptation and improvement. These weapons, though often simpler than the MP40, were reliable and versatile, and they became the standard for American forces in the war. In the end, the MP40 was not the ultimate weapon of the war, nor was it without its flaws, but it served as a bridge between the past and the future, between the old world of bolt-action rifles and the new world of rapid-fire automatic weapons. The MP40 was a weapon of its time, and its legacy, both positive and negative, helped shape the direction of future military firearm development. As the world moved into the post-war years, the lessons learned from the MP40, along with the development of new weapons like the STG-44, would change the face of warfare forever. The MP40's place in history was solidified not just by its performance on the battlefield, but by the ways it influenced both German military tactics and the weapons that would follow in the Cold War and beyond.